Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Productive Passions Podcast, where innovation meets purpose and passion powers possibility. I'm your host, Christy Tagye, and today's story takes us to the rolling hills of upstate New York, a place where sunlight, sustainability, and sheep are reshaping the future of American farming. Picture this: gleaming solar panels stretched across green fields, and between them, a flock of sheep grazes, quietly maintaining the land while clean energy is produced. This isn't a dream. It's the real-life work of Rebekah and Josh Pierce, first-generation farmers who turned an impossible challenge into a revolutionary solution. In this episode, we'll explore how solar energy and agriculture can coexist and even thrive together, tackling some of our biggest challenges around food security, renewable power, and farmland preservation. Because the truth is, the future of farming isn't somewhere far away. It's already here. Thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure having you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I wanted to start out by talking about who you are, because you wear a lot of hats. Besides being a farmer, which we'll get to in a little bit, what other things do you do?
Yeah, so my husband and I own a farm in upstate New York. We're fairly close to the Canadian border, just for some context there. Sheep grazing is probably our number one business that we do with the farm. We have about 200 head of Katahdin and Dorper cross sheep that we graze on solar farms, which obviously we'll talk about in a little bit. And I'm also a freelance writer. So my day job is sitting in front of a computer, writing mostly food and agriculture and energy related content. I do also just do general freelance work for hire. And then my side gig is helping my husband, who runs the farm, full time.
Besides being an author and farmer and writer, really, you are also an educator.
I like to think that, yeah. So I'm actually a former high school English teacher too. So I don't know if I mentioned that to you when we spoke earlier, but I taught high school English for about 5 years prior to going out kind of on my own with the freelance writing and with the farm. And so one of the things that kind of made me sad when I left teaching was that, I had to give that part of me up. But what's been really fantastic is still being able to have that outreach component through the writing that I'm doing, and then working with the community, just to kind of let them know what we're doing and why it's so important.
I did a little bit of research about what Agri-Energy is. This name came up in the 70s and 80s, but initially it was around the use of ethanol as a fuel. So corn used as a fuel. You're talking about it in a bit different way. And you and I got connected, quite frankly, because I saw somebody say something really nasty on one of your posts on LinkedIn. And I thought that was very disrespectful and did not appreciate that. When you're talking about Agri-Energy, what does that mean to you now?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I'm glad that you brought up kind of the origins of that term too, because I'm sure we'll talk about that later in this conversation. But you mentioned that you found me on LinkedIn because somebody was being nasty, which unfortunately is kind of the status quo on social media, right? But in a good way, I think that it's also drawn a lot of attention to some of the topics that we're talking about here, and they deserve the attention. They're things that need to be talked about. So the title of my book is Agri-Energy, Growing Power, Growing Food. And when I was working on the book, very early on, I had this idea that I didn't want it to be a book just about one narrow application of renewable energy and agriculture. I wanted it to really cover the full spectrum of things that are possible. And so when I first started writing, there's a lot of terms that are thrown around specifically for solar and agriculture, because that seems to be the one that's getting the most attention. It's the one that is growing the most in the United States right now. And so you'll hear terms like dual use and agrivoltaics and agri-PV. And those are fantastic terms. And I think they apply very nicely to this idea of solar in agriculture. But what I wanted to do was use a larger term, because I also wanted to talk about things like, wind and agriculture. How are farmers working, under wind turbines to grow crops or to raise livestock, and all the other, many applications of those two things that are out there. So I went with the broader term, and really I haven't seen a ton of people using it in these conversations. Obviously I was not the one who came up with it, so I will never claim to have. But I think it is a better term for describing kind of the broad, umbrella of all the potential applications that are out there.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit, and I'm sure you've heard this. Rebekah, you're taking up farmland with so-called solar farms or wind farms. How can we promote regenerative ag if alternative power sources are claiming the very land we need to produce food?
So the comment back that I always have in that conversation, and it's a complex issue, and it's a really thorny one, and there are a lot of different variables at play there. But the first thing I always say is, number one, prime farmland, prime ag land isn't prime ag land if there's not a farmer who is able or willing to farm it. So the reality in the United States right now is that roughly a third of all of us are over 65 in the ag world. The average age of the American farmer, I believe, is 58. And in 1935, we had 6.8 million farms. Now we're at 1.88 million. So the average farm size is actually getting bigger. I think it's something like 100 acres per farm back in the 1930s, and now it's more than 4 times that on average. And there's been so much consolidation and corporatization of farms in America that small farms, so even though they're like 98% of all farms in America, account for a very small percentage of that total output. Farming currently accounts for, I believe it's less than 1% of our GDP. And that's largely due to the barriers to entry, land prices, equipment prices, other input costs, which I'm sure we'll get to. And so there's not a lot of people who are willing or interested in getting into agriculture because it doesn't tend to be a very profitable business. And it's one for which there's not a lot of support. The other piece that I like to address is when you think about prime farmland. So say you're driving past, a hayfield or a cornfield or anything like that. You can't drive by a field and tell me, oh, that is high quality farmland. That is prime farmland. That is incredibly fertile. That's great ground. Obviously, there's indicators you can look at, right? But without doing a soil test to actually see what's going on, to actually see what erosion rates look like, to actually see what nutrient levels look like, to see topsoil levels without really digging deep, kind of pun intended, you can't tell that prime farmland is prime farmland just by looking at it. So I know one of the things that you and I talked about, when we first met was this idea that so much of our farmland is being taken up by renewable energy, whether that's solar or whether that's wind. The reality is that a large percentage of all of our farmland here in the United States is dedicated to growing crops that aren't technically feeding America. They're dedicated to growing things like ethanol corn. So we have 30 million acres of land in the United States that's just dedicated to corn for ethanol.
You said 30 million. That isn't necessarily going to food.
Correct. It's going to ethanol, which we've proven, through multiple studies that it's not the most efficient biofuel. And there are, additional studies that have shown that solar can produce 30 times more energy per acre than corn and 85 times more driving miles. So really, if you just did the math on that conversion alone, it's worth it. Then you have the fact that so much of our other acreage is being taken up for things like soy, which is primarily an export crop. We export about 50% of our soybeans, mostly to China, which I won't get political, but that's caused problems this year, right? So we really need to work smarter with the land we have, not harder, and think about, is the ag land that we have being utilized to the best possible ability? There's also the environmental fact, which is what you and I talked about. So corn, for example, is, and I don't mean to beat up on corn here. Obviously, we need corn. It's an important part of the economy. But, if we look just specifically at corn, we lose about a pound of topsoil for every bushel of corn that's produced, which is like 56 or so pounds of corn. So that's contributing to a major, environmental problem, especially in places like the Midwest, where we are seeing topsoil being eroded at rapid rates.
So let's talk about that for a minute. As you know, I had a great conversation with Gabe Brown several episodes ago, and that's one of the things that he talked about was the quality of our soil and topsoil and the eroding of it and what happens. You said for every acre of corn we grow, we lose a certain percentage of topsoil. Why is that? And why is that damaging? I mean, if the better soil's underneath, okay, we get rid of the topsoil and there's better soil underneath, right?
Right. Well, sort of. So when and I'm not a plant scientist by any means. So if you have any people who are operating within that realm, please don't, please don't hate me. This is not my realm. So,
sure,
but essentially, so you need topsoil, right, to grow plants because you need something for the plants to anchor their roots in. And when you are farming in kind of this conventional and highly intensive way that we have been doing for the last, 40, 50 years or so, where
does that include monocropping?
Yes. And so I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the idea of monocropping, but essentially just planting, one species of plant again and again and again. So just planting corn, just planting soy, not anything else for many miles around, not switching things up year over year. Monocropping combined with things like heavy agrochemical use, so fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, combined with, heavy tilling, which I think thankfully a lot of producers have really gotten away from that practice. But it still exists. So all of those things kind of add up, and it's, death by 1,000 cuts, that are all degrading the soil slowly over time. And so when you don't have that topsoil and when you don't have, native vegetation or, other plants kind of anchoring things in place, that soil is getting washed away into rivers, into streams, into lakes. It's, contributing to that Dust Bowl effect, which I think we all probably learned about in, middle school. And unfortunately, it's not just something that existed only in history, it's happening again. And so all of those things are really problematic. So we need to be careful about how we are managing the land so that it's, so that we still have topsoil and we still have land to grow on for future generations.
So let's talk about solar farms and wind farms, especially solar farms, because I know that's where you're working. There's some controversy about solar farms. And like I said, sort of in the intro, is like, why would you use our important land to put these solar panels, hundreds of acres of solar panels? What can we do with that land?
Yeah. So I'll give some context just to start on kind of what it is we do that inspired me to write this book in the first place. So my husband and I own J&R Pierce Family Farm. As I mentioned before, we started the farm about 10 years ago. And when we did, our goal was really to provide nutritious and affordable food to the people who live around us, ideally with as few agrochemicals as possible, which we've largely done. And so we have adopted, what you'll hear referred to often as a regenerative system of farming. So part of that means, we are moving animals to fresh pastures constantly. So in order to have a successful regenerative agriculture system, you do need, a decent amount of land so that you can be rotating animals back and forth. The problem that we had, as I'm sure many of your listeners will recognize, is that land is super expensive. And so as first generation farmers, who are coming into this with no, acreage that we've inherited, no equipment we've inherited, not even that like generational knowledge that I think you get when you're part of a long-term farming family. We had to find more creative ways to access that land without going millions of dollars into debt. And so fortunately, very early on, it was about 4 or 5 years ago, we were approached by a couple farming friends of ours. They're two brothers that own a cattle and hay farm near us, and they actually sell us the hay for our sheep in the wintertime. So it's kind of a cool relationship there. They approached us and said, "Hey, we're putting in this solar farm. We would love to have you guys graze it." These brothers, they're in their 70s. They've been farming their entire lives. They don't want to see the land go out of agriculture, but they also recognize, that signing that lease agreement with the solar farm is pretty good money. And it's something that's a lot more secure than really anything else they could choose to do. And when you consider the fact that, most farmers, at the end of their careers, they don't have things like 401ks or pensions or retirement plans to fall back on, these solar leases do provide a really attractive option, which I think is why so many farmers are turning to them.
Especially if you're 70 years old and you're thinking about, how am I going to finance the rest of my life, if nothing else?
Yeah, exactly. And land, land is the asset. Land is the retirement fund. And so farmers can put their land into solar for 4 or 5 times the amount of money what they would get from leasing to another farmer. And, that fact alone, I think, has drummed up a lot of controversy.
Sure.
I've had conversations with a lot of people who are saying, well, they should just be leasing to other farmers. And it's not quite that simple, right? Young beginning farmers, especially first generation ones, we can't afford to pay the lease rates that would allow these farmers what their property is actually worth. We've had the opportunity to lease from them in the past, and we've chosen not to, just because we don't want to undercut them. We know what land is worth. They have great land, and we just don't want to do that. So what we do, I kind of got off on a tangent here, so I apologize.
No, I love that. I love that, because this is real conversation. I love what you just said. We didn't want to do that because we didn't want to undercut them. I mean, that's community. That's caring about your neighbor. So no, I appreciate that honesty. And
yeah, so we worked with them. They got their first contract, and then we worked with the solar developer on an agreement that would allow us to graze that land. So my husband and I, we don't own very much in our own acreage. We have less than 25 acres, which again is not enough for the type of agriculture that we wanted to do at a scale that would allow us, if we were just, producing food for ourselves, that would be one thing, but we really wanted to scale this into a business that was serving the local community. And so we knew we needed that other option. So we graze solar farms that are leased by other landowners. Typically it's a farmer, though not always. So leased by other landowners to solar companies. So we serve kind of as service providers. So we are providing the vegetation management service to the solar company, meaning we not only get additional pasture for our animals, but we're also paid by the solar company to maintain the vegetation for a certain height so that it doesn't shade the panels. So that's kind of the overview.
As you talk, I have, of course, more questions. And one of them is, now that you mentioned that, you have to keep it at a certain level. And it's great. Your sheep, which we'll talk about later, that look like goats. Your sheep maintain that? Do you guys have to do additional work to help maintain that? Or are they pretty much keeping the height where it's supposed to be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we get asked that a lot. So sheep do a phenomenal job at managing the vegetation to where it needs to be. And obviously this is a fairly intensive system. I think some people get into this business thinking, great, I'll just dump, 10 sheep out on 30 acres and they'll eat it all up. No problem. The reality is, anybody who has rotationally grazed before knows is that sheep, I always compare them to like little kids. So if I put a plate of, chicken nuggets and broccoli in front of my 5-year-old kid, he's going to eat all the chicken nuggets and he's not going to eat the broccoli, right? And so we kind of have to do the same thing with sheep, because if we put them out on a solar farm, they're going to be like, ooh, chicken nugget, ooh, chicken nugget. Obviously not actual chicken nuggets.
I'm picturing that in my head, like chicken nuggets scattered.
Like just dino nuggets in a field. And they won't go for the broccoli. So we have to, fence them off into smaller, sub paddocks, interior paddocks, to make sure they're getting everything and they're not just getting the yummy stuff, the forage equivalent of chicken nuggets. So there is some management that goes on there. And then, often we do have to do some like cleanup mowing. Usually we're also responsible for the area that's outside of the interior fence. So the places that the sheep wouldn't have access to. And really that's mostly just for aesthetics sake. So things don't look overgrown and neighbors don't complain. And then there are certain cases too where we do have to do some cleanup mechanically within the arrays. Usually this is on sites where, because all the sites that we're grazing weren't originally designed to be grazed. So they weren't necessarily planted with mixtures that would be seed mixtures that would be most conducive to that, or the design is such that the sheep aren't adequately hitting everything. So we do go in and, clean things up with mowing as we need to, but we try to let the sheep hit it first, as much as possible. Usually and it depends on the site, but usually we'll be on a site at least 3 times throughout the season. We only graze from about April to November just because of where we live. Stuff more or less stops growing after November. We could keep the sheep out there and feed hay. We could stockpile forage, as I know a lot of people do. But for us, it's more conducive just to bring them back home. They have their lambs in March, and then we get them back out to the solar farms in April.
This is incredibly complex. When I first talked to you, I thought, oh, have fun. Have some sheep, put them out under the solar panels and let them go to town. What a great life. But you've had to figure a lot of this out as you go. How have you been learning? Because we did talk initially, and I do remember you telling me you were a teacher and your husband was a teacher. Mm-hmm. So how do you go from being educators in classroom to being farmers with animals and farming around solar farms? This isn't your background. Mm-mm. How did you learn this?
By accident and by messing up a lot.
Wait, say that again, because I think that's so important. It's true of a lot of things. So wait, how did you learn?
By accident and by messing up a lot. And I guess, Dr. Google is also really helpful too. It's just one of those things, and I think this is true of anybody getting into farming, kind of regardless of what you're doing or where you live or what kind of background you have. But you really have to experiment. No amount of reading books in the world, I think, can substitute for hands-on experience. And I say that as somebody who writes books and greatly appreciates books. But you need to it's trial by fire, right? We've had seasons where it felt like it was mistake after mistake after mistake and, just washing money down the drain. And then we've had seasons where it felt like we were on top of the world. So it's really just a matter of sticking with it and recognizing there's always something more to be learned. And I think that's especially true in this world that we occupy right now with the solar grazing, because even in talking to other producers, there's not really anybody, local. It's not like if you're, a dairy farmer in a community that has been comprised of dairy farms for decades, you're always going to find somebody you can talk to and ask for advice. And that advice is going to be pretty locally relevant to where you are Sure. and to what you're trying to do. This is such a new and developing industry. We're all scattered, and there's thousands of people that are doing this around the country and around the world, but it looks a lot different kind of wherever you are. And so even on the sites, that we manage, we, I think, are up to 7 or 8 sites now, and we graze in 4 counties across upstate New York. No 2 sites are the same. We have one site that is designated a pollinator friendly site, and that needs to be managed a lot differently, than the site with the tracker panels and the site with the fixed panels. And, this site has kind of a weird fence design, and this site has, water issues. And so there's a lot of kind of trial and error that you have to do to figure out what the best approach is. But the main thing is just to keep staying open to those experiences and not assuming that you know everything, because you never do.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about startup costs. Like you said, you guys have 25 acres. And when we spoke the first time, you said you went very far north. Your closest city is Vancouver?
Montreal.
I'm sorry, is Montreal. So your closest city, sorry, Montreal, that was primarily because of the cost of land. But there are other costs as well. So what's the reality? Like this, it sounds really cool. I think I want to try this out. What is the reality for someone who is thinking about? What are the things that we should be thinking about?
So it's definitely not something you would want to do as a get rich quick scheme. Just in the cost of animals alone, you're talking easily, like at a very low price, $150 to $200 per head per animal. And obviously, the nice thing about sheep is they make more every year. All you have to do is add a ram. But there's still that cost, and it takes a while to scale, whether you're buying more animals or whether you're growing your herd the old fashioned way. And so if you think about the fact, everybody always asks, well, how many sheep do you need per acre? And again, it's kind of like, how long is a piece of string, right? Like it really, really depends on the site. Like how old is it? When was the vegetation established? What kind of vegetation is it? What climate are you grazing in? What kind of sheep do you have? Are they ewes? Are they rams? Are they lactating ewes? Are they pregnant ewes? There's a lot of variables that go into that. The general kind of industry average is 3 to 4 ewes per acre. So if you do the math in your head and you figure that, we only graze community scale solar right now, or distributed solar. So solar sites that are pretty much just servicing the local area. We don't have any utility scale sites, which are the 1,000+ acre sites that you're hearing a lot about in the news. But even if you're just talking a 30-acre site, that's a lot of animals, right? And then the costs go beyond that. So if you're not grazing solar year round like us, you have to factor in the cost of hay. You have to factor in the cost of, like vaccinations for your animals. If you feed supplemental grain, that's something you need to factor in. You need to factor in fencing because, all of the solar sites are required to have an exterior fence, per the electrical code, but they aren't fenced for the most part. The sites we graze, none of them are fenced internally. So we need to have polywire.
So that's your cost.
That's our cost. We need to have solar, ironically, we have to have solar panels to power our electric fences inside the solar arrays, right? So there's a lot of costs that go to a trailer. Trailers are going to be, thousands of dollars, even if you're buying used. Insurance, because that's another piece. You have to have insurance to be on these sites. So there's a lot that goes into it. I haven't, sat down and crunched the numbers because this is something we've accumulated over the period of the last 10 years, but they're significant. So it's not something you would want to go into without really having, a solid commitment to it and an understanding of what those costs are going to be.
So let's talk about the difference between solar farm that is just mechanically managed with mowing and weed eating, whatever else they do, versus with livestock. What are some of the differences?
They're profound, is what I'll say first. When we first started solar grazing, my perception of it was really that it was an economic means to an end. So it was a way for us to lower our production costs and, kind of increase the stability and economic viability of our farm because it was long-term income that wasn't subjected to, fluctuating commodity prices and things like that. And so when we first got started, I really just viewed things from that economic mindset. I actually was not the world's biggest fan of solar when we started out. As this has progressed and I've done more research and I've seen what these sites actually look like, obviously my opinion has changed dramatically. So the biggest benefit when you're talking about managing a site with livestock, and we keep talking about sheep, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, but sheep are not the only option. There's lots of people who are growing vegetable crops, who are, grazing cattle, chickens, pastured pig breeds. There's really no limit to what can be done on solar farms. But since my expertise is sheep, I'll stay in my lane for this one for now. So the biggest benefit to a solar company is really going to be that public perception piece. As we've talked about a lot in this conversation, there's so much pushback over turning agricultural land into solar. And when you bring in sheep, a lot of that resistance, not all of it, there's still other concerns that have to be addressed, but a lot of that tends to go away. I mean, people really like to see the pictures of the cute fuzzy lambs running around the solar panels. And so that's a big piece of it for them. In a lot of cases, grazing with sheep is also cheaper than mechanical mowing. So we have, as I mentioned before, we have mechanically mowed some of these sites and, excuse my language, but it is the biggest pain in the ass you can possibly imagine. And I think a lot of vegetation management companies, so, your traditional landscapers, I think they have, I won't speak for the entire industry, but I think there is that same concern. There's things that you need to maneuver around, whether it's the panels themselves or it's wires or inverters or anything like that. And that's not always easy, especially if you're running larger equipment. The liability can also be pretty significant, both for a traditional mower and for a solar company. Because so as an example, this year we were in a record drought where I live. We had very, very little rain throughout the month of August and into September. And I remember I was on a site weed whacking later this fall after we'd gotten some rain. And I hit just a small rock on the ground with the blade of the weed whacker. And it sent out like this shower of sparks. And I remember thinking to myself, thank God it's not dry anymore, because that would have started a fire. Now, when you're talking about solar, especially in places that are very wildfire prone, like Southern California, that's a huge problem. So sheep aren't creating sparks as they eat. They're not kicking rocks back up into the panels, which is another piece. So in many cases, even if sheep grazing or any other form of agri-energy, even if that is a little bit more expensive, whether that's in terms of what you're paying the producer or whether that's in terms of modifying a site design, a lot of times those savings, what seems like savings, are actually coming out on the other end because you're at a significantly higher risk of damage to the panels and to wildfires.
Mm. Gosh, so many things that we don't even think about when we're ready to judge one way or another. You were mentioning other animals. So other than sheep, what other animals? You mentioned cows, but aren't those Don't they need to get under the solar panels, and aren't cows a little bit taller? What should people be thinking about if they're going to go after this and they're deciding what kind of livestock to use?
So one of the really cool things that happened, it was a little bit annoying at the time, but I think also reflective of how cool this is. When I was writing my book, I kept having to revise it because every time I would check the news, new information was coming out because this is such, a fledgling industry.
Right.
And so when I first started writing, everybody was like, you can't run cows on solar. Like there's a few people doing it, but it's not a good idea. They're going to damage everything. They're not going to be able to get under the panels. They're going to rub, against the beams. They're going to chew on wires. We can't do cattle on solar. Now there's this whole emerging movement. It's called cattle voltaics, of people who are not only advocating for these systems, but providing really great boots on the ground evidence of it happening. And so cattle I think are a good fit for solar, because our beef industry is in such trouble right now. And there's such a market for it. I love raising sheep on solar. Obviously I think they're really like the plug and play option for solar. It's easy to put them on pre-existing sites that were built, maybe 10 or 15 years ago without having to put a lot of thought into how the site is designed. But the problem is we just don't eat as much lamb as we eat of beef. Obviously, things do need to change in that regard because we import millions of pounds of lamb from Australia and New Zealand, and very little is produced domestically. So there is a domestic market for lamb that we need to tap back into. But even, with that considered, I think we do need to think about what other crops or what other livestock can be grazed or raised on solar, because we can't survive on lamb alone, right? So as far as cattle go, I think the most important thing to consider is how the site is designed. So not all panels and not all sites. So all the sites that we graze have panels at varying heights and of varying designs and styles. So there are a lot of manufacturers out there now that are, specializing in producing racking that is significantly taller than kind of the status quo that I think you were referring to there. Things like burying the cables also makes it easier, not only for cattle, but for a site that was going to be designed for any kind of larger agricultural machinery, because there are people who are doing things like harvesting a hay crop on solar farms. So there's not really, the sky is the limit when you think about how a site could be designed to accommodate livestock. Often it does come with an additional cost, but as I mentioned before, I think a lot of those costs, especially once we start looking, just beyond that initial balance sheet, I think a lot of those costs are well worth the investment overall.
So I'm curious, and I hadn't planned to ask you this, but I'm curious, now that you've had this experience, do you think you can consult with solar manufacturers to say, look, to make this easier for everybody, for the animals, for the farmers, for the landowners, for yourselves, build them this way, and that way you can accommodate all types of livestock. You reduce the risk of damage to your equipment and whatever other benefits there are. Is there enough conversation with people like you happening from the manufacturers to put in best practices? Mm-hmm. Yes.
The conversations are definitely starting, which is really reassuring. For a long time, it was very much that, well, we need more research. We need to see what this looks like. We need more data. And I have nothing wrong with that. I totally agree. The problem is, for a struggling farmer doesn't have 20 years to wait for the research to be published. And that's an exaggeration. But the good news is the conversations are starting to happen. I've had these conversations with a lot of people who work on that side of the industry. And I think really the biggest barrier to it is getting everybody fully invested in it. So one of the most frustrating pieces of the industry is that when we are communicating with solar companies, often we will get connected with somebody who is a really, ardent believer in how important agri-energy systems are. And then the issue becomes, a lot of solar companies aren't designing and developing and managing their own projects from start to finish. So you might have one company that's doing the siting and the planning, and then you have another that's doing construction, and then you have another that's doing O&M. And so often, the message
O&M.
O&M. So operations and maintenance, which is, that's where we come in. Sorry for the acronyms.
No, that's great.
And so often, you'll find somebody in the planning stages, which is generally when people approach us. Ideally, that's when we get approached is very early on, when they're going to the towns and they're talking to the boards and they're trying to drum up that community support. And we will find somebody in that company who is, rah solar grazing. And then the project gets passed to another company and then to another company. And so by the time you get to the end of it, it's kind of like that game you play in middle school. You remember Telephone, that game? Where, you talk about the importance of it. And then by the end, they're like, wait, what? And
so are
really
the first people like brokers? Like they're the people who go in and broker the deal and then like sell it off to...
Sometimes. So it depends. And then, there are companies we work with too that do the whole thing from start to finish. And I love working with those companies because you don't have that like lost in translation thing. But yeah, sometimes you're dealing with a completely different person at the beginning than you are at the end. Because you have different people going in to get the land and to get it through the approval process, and then a different company building it, and then a final company that's managing it throughout the life cycle. They get bought and sold a lot. And I think that's something else people are very critical of in the industry, but it's an industry, it's a business just like any other. And so it's just something we have to live with. But again, I think, my message to if anybody was listening to this and they work for a solar company and they're interested in this, do the best possible work you can do to be an advocate for this and be a mouthpiece for it. Because ultimately, I think, the long-term viability of the industry really does depend on it. We have to be outspoken about best land use practices and how we can set up these systems for success from start to finish.
You mentioned towards the beginning of the conversation, you wanted to contribute to nutrient-dense food for your community. How are you guys doing that?
So I think I mentioned briefly in the conversation earlier on as well that we are, strong believers in this idea of regenerative agriculture. And so what that means kind of, and this is a very, very high level, watered down explanation that I don't think Gabe Brown would love, but I'm going to try to keep it simple, is just thinking about the way you work with the land in a way that recognizes and respects whole systems rather than just yield. So thinking about not just what you're getting out of the land, but how the way you're interacting with it feeds into multiple systems. So environmental health, soil health, wildlife health, water quality, community health, the nutrient density of your food. There's multiple studies that have come out and shown that food that is grown in this way and that is sold locally rather than being shipped across the country is much higher. It's more nutrient dense than the alternative. And so I think it's really important that we get back to these systems. So for us, what that looks like is, raising animals on pasture. So we have, in addition to the sheep, we also have grass-fed beef that we raise on pasture. We have pastured poultry. So they're in what we call chicken tractors. I guess for turkeys, it'd be turkey tractors. And so those we move every day. So chickens don't really, they're not ruminants like sheep and cattle. So they don't technically need the grass. So that's why a lot of producers say just, feed them corn and stick them in a corner. But there are a lot of benefits to soil health and to the overall health of the animals, and really in lowering our overall costs when we do things this way.
And I disagree. I can't speak for Gabe, but I think he would like that explanation. So how are you received in your community now versus when you started?
I don't necessarily think anybody, well, I can't say that. Nobody has come to us directly and said, we don't like what you're doing. There was very much this idea when we first got started, and I think this persists a little bit, because there are some very conflicting opinions about what constitutes real agriculture in the United States. And I've gotten kind of blasted on LinkedIn by people for this too, who say, you're just grazing a few sheep on solar farms. That's not really farming. It's only if you are, a cattle rancher with 2,000 head, or if you are growing a commodity crop, or something like corn or soy, or wheat, like that's when you are considered a real farmer. And so where we live, dairy has always been kind of the predominant industry. You're not really considered a real farmer unless you're a dairy farmer. But the sad reality of that is that dairy farms around here are going out of business left and right. You can drive down a street where there used to be 5 or 6 dairy farms, and now there's one, if you're lucky. And the ones that do exist are extremely large and consolidated, and they are operating in that, CAFO style model, that's gotten a lot of attention lately. So it's confined animal agriculture. And I think, dairy is kind of an interesting use case because you don't necessarily see as many producers, even the ones who are committed to those more organic principles. You don't see as many dairy producers grazing animals outdoors versus just keeping them in tie stalls in a barn, and that's largely due to cost and practicality because they need to be inside twice a day for milking, and so it's harder to facilitate that kind of system.
Sure.
So and I am not a dairy farmer, so I'm not going to speak to that at all because it's very much outside of my lane. But you also hear a lot of bad press about confined animal agriculture in terms of things like, thousands of chickens or millions of chickens being packed into a barn. Hog facilities are also pretty famous examples of that. And so that's really what we're striving hard not to do. We want to make sure our animals are spread out because it's not good for the animal. It's not good for the environment. And ultimately, it can really increase your production costs too. If you're constantly battling illnesses, if you're constantly having to, feed supplemental feed that you may not otherwise need. Yeah. So in our area, dairy farming has really been the predominant agricultural industry for decades. But dairy farms are going out of business. And so for a long time, we were viewed as not real farmers because we're just the weird sheep farmers. There's even people who go so far. There's a great guy named Will Harris who runs one of the country's most famous regenerative farms in Georgia. And he always jokes with me, he joked with me in an interview that his family refers to them as pasture maggots because they're taking up valuable space for cattle. I don't think of them that way. I love our sheep, but the reality is a lot of people don't view sheep as a legitimate agricultural industry.
So I want to pause there for a minute before we move on, because didn't you say earlier on that we're importing sheep from other countries instead of having them here? And we can have them here, and there's a use for them here. Not that there's anything wrong with sheep from other countries, but if we could improve our land, improve the maintenance of these solar farms, have healthy animals, provide for our food supply. I'm sorry, but what's the downside in that?
Oh, so I didn't say it made any sense.
Oh, okay. Okay.
There isn't one. There is one, right? It's just, it's one of those, like decades old stereotypes that I think people have. I'll talk to farmers, old dairy farmers up here who don't think vegetable farming is legitimate. And, the reality is that, first of all, we're not feeding our country on corn and soy anyway. And cattle are important and all of these commodities are important. And that's not what I'm saying. But the reality is we need, a very diversified agricultural economy. We need a diversified energy economy too, which is, part of the reason why I like this Agri-Energy thing so much. I could, my 5-year-old would be very content to just eat those chicken nuggets all day long, but he's not going to be a healthy kid if he does. And so we really need to recognize that there are multiple other forms of agriculture besides, the big 3 that we've been conditioned to believe are the real farms. And so, I say that, but I do think, as we've scaled up and as we have grown our operations and as we've added cattle to our operations, which is another piece of the puzzle, I think we have gotten viewed as more legitimate. And I think
did they wear you down, or did you just need a different kind of animal?
We wanted our own beef. So that was kind of why we started doing that. We started with 1 cow a few years ago, and we've just grown gradually since then. There's a huge demand for local beef, and we're happy to be able to meet it to a very small extent. We do not have a large beef herd at all, but yeah. So I think opinions are changing. I think we've worn other people down by kind of stubbornly asserting like this is our business. It's not a hobby farm. Nothing against hobby farms, but, this is something that we are doing. It's my husband's sole form of income, and we're proud of it. And we think it's important. And I think slowly but surely, as people realize the benefits of what we're doing, at least locally and at least to my face, you never know what goes on behind the scenes. But for the most part, I think the reception's been positive here.
So I just have to get back to quickly. I mentioned your sheep that look like goats. There's a little inside, I guess, story about that.
But there was a specific one that I'm thinking of where, I posted a picture of our sheep, and just for some background, we have Katahdin Dorper crossed sheep, which are hair sheep. And so they don't grow like that really like fuzzy, fluffy wool that you'll see on like a merino, for example. They don't look like the storybook sheep. And so somebody commented, those are goats. I'm like, nope, they're definitely sheep. And then they continued. Like it was a continuous conversation. Then they're messaging me privately. It's like, nope, I promise you they are sheep. They are my sheep. They are definitely not goats. And so that's also really important to mention because, I won't say never because I don't like speaking in absolutes in this industry because as I've mentioned before, it's something that is rapidly changing. Right now, goats are not a great option for solar just because they like to climb and they like to jump and they like to chew on things, which as you can imagine is not great for solar panels. So there is a very clear differentiator between sheep and goats, and we do not have goats. We have sheep.
Rebekah, who has had the most influence on you, personally or professionally or both? And do they know it?
Oh gosh, that's really tough. It's hard to pick just one person because as a farmer, and especially in an industry like this, it's really a patchwork, of conversations and, personal interactions and, articles that people write, and all those sorts of things that come together to kind of form this larger narrative of who you are and how you run your business. I'll kind of on a personal level, I'll call out my husband because he obviously, he's my business partner. He's my partner in life, as cheesy as that sounds, and he's probably going to make fun of me for that. But the reality is that,
what's your husband's name?
His name is Josh.
Josh, don't pick on Rebekah. That was a compliment.
And so we've built this business together and we've learned together and learned from each other, which is really valuable. And I think anybody who works in ag with their spouse will recognize that is not always easy. There's a lot of, we joke that we want to make this t-shirt that says, I'm sorry for what I said when we were working sheep. Cause you do kind of have to forgive and just move on quickly, but there's been a lot of learning experience there too. And so I think that's really important. But then if I branch out, and think bigger picture, there have been a ton of people who have been hugely instrumental in helping us learn about this industry and helping us get the connections that we need to be successful. So one of the first people that, comes to mind, her name is Lexi Hain. And for several years, she was, I believe the president, I'm hoping I'm not messing that up, but of the American Solar Grazing Association, and really one of its founding members. And so I think a lot of us consider her and her wife, Marguerite Walls, to be kind of the like some of the earliest adopters of agri-energy and solar grazing here in the United States. They're also in New York, a few hours away from us. And the reason why I call Lexi out in particular is because I didn't learn about what these systems were until I think it was like 2019. And I had actually been hired to write an article for the magazine Acres USA. And I was just Googling, who can I talk to? Like, who can I interview? Who knows anything about this? And she was the first person who came up, and she took my call. She was fantastic, answered all my questions. And ever since then, she has really been just kind of like this tireless supporter of the work we're doing and for the industry in general. She is the type of person who is always willing to connect people, to answer questions, really, without any personal benefit to herself, but just to benefit, agriculture and solar as a whole. So she's one that comes to mind. And of course, there are dozens of other people as well.
So what's next for you and for the farm?
It's a good question. So my book comes out November 20th. So right now, that's kind of the primary push. I'm also working on a second book that is exploring, and I don't want to let it out too much too soon because it's still very early in the ideation phases, but exploring our separation from food in something that I call food NIMBYism. So one of the terms that gets thrown around a lot in the solar world is NIMBY, which is not in my backyard. And it's this idea that, yes, we think renewable energy is important, but we don't want it happening right here. We want it happening in other communities. often where they don't necessarily have the resources to argue against them. And so I wanted to take that concept and apply it to how our food is produced. So why are we so comfortable with this idea that food production needs to be out of sight and out of mind? So that's kind of my next project I'm working on. And then for the farm, really our goal is just to continue, with the solar grazing and with the farming that we're already doing. And then hopefully expanding, by adding a few more. We'd like to get up to, 500 or so ewes, double or more our herd size so that we can be on more solar farms, and potentially adding more species to that mix as well.
Well, I am so excited about what comes next. I'm excited about what you're doing and appreciate your time. And I'm going to ask now, will you come back after you write the next book and talk to us about that?
I would love to. It might be a few years from now. These things take forever. Okay. I would love to.
That's okay. And when your current book comes out, Agri-Energy, where can the audience find that book?
It is pretty much wherever books are sold. So Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Island Press is my publisher. So you can go directly to their website as well. Pretty much wherever you normally buy books. It is not, I've been asked a few times, there is an ebook if you're a Kindle person. There is not an audiobook yet, but I'm hopeful that maybe that will be something in the works soon, because I love audiobooks too. They're great for learning stuff while getting things done.
Rebekah, it has been such a pleasure talking to you. It's been such an education. I'm not going to lie. I told my husband, we're going to have to listen to this together once this episode is published. Very excited about what you're doing to contribute to, honestly, we didn't say this, but to climate change, to improving our environment. I think all of that's very important. And I thank you for what you're doing. And thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I'm glad you made the connection. And it's always nice to talk about these things because I think, at the end of the day, it's conversation, where real change starts to happen.
Wow, I learned a lot. What an incredible conversation with Rebekah, a true pioneer, showing us that farming and clean energy don't have to compete. They can collaborate. Her journey reminds us that innovation isn't always about starting over. Sometimes it's about rethinking what already works and finding new ways to make it thrive. If today's episode inspired you, you can dive even deeper into this movement in Rebekah's book, Agri-Energy, Growing Power, Growing Food, available wherever books are sold. And hey, before you go, do us a quick favor. Subscribe to the Productive Passions podcast so you never miss an episode. Like, share, and leave a comment to tell us what you thought or how you see the future of sustainable farming evolving. Your support helps us grow this community and keeps these important stories reaching new ears. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and keep creating change that matters.